If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Campers, what is the creepiest, strangest, or straight up scariest thing you've experienced while camping in the woods? When I turned 18, my brother and his friends took me camping in a spot called Devil's Hole in Barrington Tops, northwest of Sydney, Australia. It was just a typical camp spot, a clearing in the trees with enough room to set up a few tents and a fire pit in the middle. After a day of four-wheel driving in the roads around the campsite, we went hunting for firewood, gathered a sizable pile, including an entire fallen gum tree, about 30 meters long. Night fell, the fire was roaring, and beer was being consumed in great quantity. As usual, people were going off into the trees frequently for a pee, making room for more beer. At one point I headed into the bush, to a spot I'd claimed as my own personal toilet. My brother followed with a torch, since it was pitch black and it's not a bad idea to stick together in the Australian bush. We walked along a small path, about 50 meters from the campsite. After emptying our bladders, we turned around and back onto the same path. We went about 5 meters, when we noticed something standing on the path. A kangaroo, probably 1.5 meters tall, standing there looking at us. We didn't hear it approach, which was strange since it was fairly dense bush, and there were sticks and leaves all over the ground. The kangaroo bounded off into the darkness, revealing something even more unusual. Behind it, on the formerly empty path, was 3 sticks, standing up in a triangle shape, tied together at the top. We went for a closer look, and it was the way back to the campsite anyway. Sitting on top of the 3 sticks, was a small human-shaped figure, made out of twigs, similar to this. Underneath the triangle was a piece of tree bark, covered in different colored paints. At this point we were pretty confused, but being a pair of drunk idiots, we picked all the stuff up, headed back to the campsite, and threw it in the fire. We didn't see any other signs of kangaroos, or any wildlife really, over the rest of the time there, another day and night, just that one lone kangaroo that appeared out of thin air. After a few years I did some research, and it's possible we encountered a kurdacha, an Aboriginal ritual executioner sometimes compared to a skinwalker. I used to run a Cub Scout pack years ago, and one weekend we were camping at a Scout Association campsite. At about 2 a.m. on the Saturday morning I was woken by one of the boys screaming. It was really loud, really terrified screaming. I crouched out of my tent, and as I ran to where the boys' tent were, a row of dome tents with 4 boys in each, the screaming stopped. I was looking for a tiger or something dragging a Cub Scout out and devouring him, not that we get tigers in southeast London, the screaming had been that terrible. But there was just silence. No other kids had woken up, but I'd been joined by the other 2 leaders, equally worried and mystified. I couldn't believe that the other boys hadn't woken up or that there wasn't anyone crying. Just silence. We still had the same number of boys in the morning. It didn't happen again, and we never did find out who it was or what was up. I'm from a Iroquois reservation in Ontario, Canada. It's almost like you can ask anyone from around here if they've experienced any kind of paranormal stuff, and they usually have a story. My culture and heritage is filled with stories of otherworldly beings and creatures, and stories of how things came to be before Europeans inhabited the territory. I'm naturally skeptical about a lot of what people say they see in the bush here, as I've hunted the territory my entire life. I've come across a lot of things in the bush some might consider paranormal, various animal cries and howls, owls flying at low light, decomposing animals in water, etc. This particular time I wasn't hunting though. My family homestead is situated almost a half km into the bush. It was early summer just as the fireflies were coming out. A belief of the Iroquois is that fireflies are a sign that Indian medicine is at its most powerful, this time of year. Good and bad. So I get home from work a little after midnight. I turn off the car and get out to start walking up the path to the house. Normal routine. This night though, I stop to look at the fireflies up on the hill behind my home. It looks amazing. So my porch wraps around the house, and I walk to the back of the house and start walking slowly up the hill. All of a sudden I think I hear some beating sound like music, and I look back to see if my car radio was still on. From a distance I could see the car was off and no sound was coming from that direction. So I walk up to the top of the hill, and that's when the sound gets louder. I start to hear it clearly. From the top of the hill, looking down onto the other side into the bush line, I no longer see any fireflies. All I hear is the faint sound of a water drum beating, and a low raspy voice signing an old Indian song. I just turned around and went inside and tried to convince myself I wasn't crazy. It was the only spiritual experience I have ever had in my life, and I go out back to that spot every summer and lay down tobacco and cedar for my visitor. One of my longtime best friends and I had a tradition to meet somewhere and go camping every New Year's. We went to one of our favorite places and were walking around trails we had walked for years in the dense woods around a lake shortly after sunrise, chatting about life, plans, catching up. A lake around sunrise is one of the most peaceful, quiet, and calming things when it's really cold. No birds, bugs, or animals are even making rustling noises. We are enjoying this peaceful chat with a hike, and then we hear some twigs snapping. Weird, there weren't any cars parked at the lot when we got here last night. Must be a deer or something. We kept walking for a few yards, then heard it again. We looked around, saw a figure over 6 feet tall, dark in color, built like a bear, while squinting to see through the thick woods. We only had a pocket knife and a small sheathed knife, and this was horrifying to see. We kept slowly walking to not show panic while keeping an eye on the figure, which was now following us at a distance of 10 to 20 yards and was becoming more visible. After a few minutes of trying to keep our cool, not go into a panic run, and get back to our campsite, we find a deer. It was a large buck that was ripped into 2 halves with fresh blood all over the trail and scattered meat around the trail. We kept walking for another minute, which felt like an hour, then bolted when we looked back, didn't see or hear the large figure in the woods, and bolted back to our campsite. We packed up in a hurry, found a park ranger, and all he said was there were rumors of various predators that were being seen in the area for the first time in decades, but didn't have any confirmed sightings or prints. I never figured out what that was in the woods. My friends and I used to camp at this abandoned campground. I'm not sure who found it first, or why, but it was free and that's all that mattered. I arrived late the first night, so I have to bunk awkwardly with several people in a tent. We just finally figured out how to arrange ourselves so the guys weren't nuts to butts when we heard it. Opera music. Full orchestral accompaniment and a beautiful, though faint, soprano voice. No one else had been in the campground when I got there. I was the last to arrive well after sundown. There were no houses around. A river bordered one side and a large river valley farm was on the other. It was eerily silent all night until the opera singing started. The second year we went there, we expected more singing, which we got, but only on the first night, which was still super creepy, but we had been expecting it. But that year we also got a campsite filled with owls. I've never seen this many owls in one place in my life. There had to have been at least a dozen of those orbite bastards hanging out in the bush surrounding our campsite. They didn't seem to be afraid of us since they lingered every single night, observing us as we went about making dinner. Unnerving to say the very least. We never went back to that place, and I've honestly never been able to find it on a paper map. This means nothing. I'm shit with maps, but I think it's still weird. While settling in at Sandy Balls as part of my Duke of Edinburgh award, we started hearing noises of bikers, cyclists, not Hell's Angels, coming down the path. Now, we were at the bottom of the campsite. This place is a luxury site, and they didn't really want a bunch of grubby 16-year-olds, so we were camping right at the bottom of a hill. It was a dead end, it led to nothing but cow pastures. We'd broken the Duke of Edinburgh rules earlier and headed up to the main facility to enjoy the bar and watch the World Cup. I remember Croatia beating someone famous 3-1 if that dates it. A guy called Jarny scored, and we stumbled back to our tent. By this point it was dark, so we shut up shop and called it a night, 3 in their private luxury tent, and 3 in the pauper, for example school equipment, tent. For the first hour, we kept hearing a cyclist. No lights. No other noise. But a cyclist, coming down the path, riding, tinkling the bell. Then silence. And this happened, several times. Each from the same direction, never any return noise. In the morning we got up, looked around. There was nothing, the place was a dead end. There was nowhere for a cyclist to go. We were a little creeped out by the phantom noises, so we headed off to the creepy abandoned fireplace that was our next waypoint. Got stuck in mud, chased by a cow, trapped at a fort, then ended up at a Canadian War Memorial before we were picked up. This isn't my story, this is my dad's story. My dad and my grandparents were camping out by Lake Tahoe, and all day my grandpa said that they felt like they were being watched. My grandpa described a general feeling of just something not feeling right. That night they had built a big fire and had gotten in their tents, and they began to hear all the strange noises. They described it as a wolf howling, but as if it were 10 times deeper. My grandpa decided it would be best to keep the fire lit all night. My grandpa stayed up all night out of protection of his family and out of fear. Around 3:45 he says he opened the tent flap and looked outside to see what he says is the most terrifying thing he's ever seen. A large black humanoid figure walking circles around the fire. The thing had no distinguishable features except for its giant pair of yellow eyes. Just then my grandpa said an awful scent filled the air, like something had been rotting for over 8 years. The last thing my grandpa saw before he went back into the tent was the figure returning to the woods, and he saw 3 other figures exactly like the one he saw waiting for the figure. Grandpa loaded his gun and he says nothing else happened and they left the next day. This story still gives me nightmares today. I've told this before and it always gets buried. While we weren't camping but rather driving in the mountains. But a few years back I was in Colorado with some friends on our way to a mountain for a ski trip. On the way to our hotel we were driving up and down these winding roads deep in the mountains which seemed like forever. It was pitch black outside and around 3 a.m. and we had to at least be 45-ish minutes from the nearest town, and it was cold, like see your own breath freezing cold. As we were driving along, my friends and I all see 4 figures walking on the road coming towards us. We all get weird feelings inside, but I did especially, and the hair on my neck stood up. Something didn't seem right. We were way too far away from a town and it was too cold for hitchhikers or hikers of any sort. We get closer and closer, and as we got right next to these people we slowed down and we realized that they literally had no faces. 4 people walking in the dead of the night wearing black hoods and cape-like gowns, and they had no faces. And by no faces I mean like no eyes, mouth, ears, just blank faces almost white in color. I'm familiar with ski masks and these were not ski masks. They had hoods on like something from Scream almost. My friends and I all freaked the fuck out speeding away, and my toughest manliest friend of us all was crying. Mind you, he was in his late 20s. It was the most afraid I've ever been and it still scares me thinking about and typing out. No idea what they were or anything. Demons maybe? It will forever be a mystery. We didn't sleep well the next few nights/months. I went backpacking into the wilderness alone this summer. Things were uneventful and I intentionally went to a place where people don't tend to go. But just before dark, I heard the voices of 2 men muttering. No matter what I did, I couldn't see them. But I was trying to be discreet myself, so that they didn't see me, a young girl, just chillin' in the wilderness completely by myself. Anyway, I never tracked down those voices, and they continued until just after nightfall. I armed myself with my weapons, made my dinner, had a fire, and went to bed. I didn't hear anything again until about 4 a.m. At that time, I began to hear the sound of what I can only describe as a baseball bat or a thick branch being hit up against a tree trunk. It happened over and over again in a distinct pattern, until the sun came up. It came from the same exact spot as where I heard those voices. But again, I never saw anything. The next day I'm telling my coworker about it. He is an avid outdoorsman who writes published work about backpacking in this region. He knows everything about this place. He is a logical, serious man, not prone to fanciful ideas at all. He asked if anything happened, and I told him that. I finished with, it must have been a deer rubbing its antlers on the trees, right? He looked me dead in the eyes and told me it sounds like what I heard was Bigfoot tree knocking. He then told me that for decades, he's been told about area sightings and encounters with a Bigfoot type of creature. This happened about a half a mile away from where I was. Great. So it was either 2 creepy men fucking with me, or the New York Bigfoot. Either way, creepy and uncool. One summer my family went camping in the Wind Rivers. As we left our site to do some hiking we passed a group of scruffy young guys packing up. I remember one of them smearing mud on the license plates of their trucks. As we hiking along we carried trash bags to pick up litter along the trail. A mile in we started finding bits of burned clothing. The bits grew more numerous as we went up the trail. It became clear that we were picking up white long underwear, drab green pants or shirt, and bits of a bra. We followed the bits off the trail into a recently abandoned campsite. There had been 4 small tents set up around it. The clothing that we had been finding clearly came from that fire, which was still smoldering. In fact, the fire pit was a massive burned something. The area had a feeling associated with it. It made you feel alone, it made your skin crawl. We continued our hike, all the time talking about the oddness of the site. On our return to the trailhead we ran into a dozen forest rangers preparing to ride horses up the trail. They questioned us, had we seen a female forest ranger? She hadn't been seen since the day before. I was 13 at my grandfather's hunting camp. My uncle had just bought a new hunting camera and wanted to test it out, so he set it up out in the woods. I got the brilliant idea to go up in the woods with my 2 other cousins and moon it, so when he checked the card, instead of wildlife, he would have seen some lovely butt cheeks. Hilarious to a 13-year-old's mind, and after some convincing my other 2 cousins were in, but we had to go under the cover of darkness. So we set our alarms for 3 a.m. and pass out. By 3:15 we all sneak outside, throw on our headlamps and start walking. We know the camera is about a mile away. The trail goes over 2 pretty big hills, and the camera is in a valley on the far side of the second hill. We start walking as normal, and everything is good. The excitement starts building, and we're pretty giddy that we are pulling this glorious prank. After a few minutes of brisk walking, we get to the top of the second hill. My older cousin, who knows the area more than me, stops as he gets to the top. As I make my way to the top, I see why. Off in the distance about 400 yards is a spotlight. Its bluish/white color illuminates nearly half of the hill it's point at. This thing was crazy bright. By this time all three of us were looking at the light, and my older cousin tells us to turn off our headlamps. We stand there in silence. Me, being the 13-year-old pussy I was, started to get freaked out. Aliens is the first thing that comes to my mind, and I tell my oldest cousin we have to leave. I turn on my headlamp and turn around about to head back to the campsite. As soon as I turn my light back on, the super bright blue light starts to slowly turn and stops right on us. No bobbing, or movement from the light besides just a slow, consistent pan right over towards our direction. Just inching, as slowly as possible. At the point I nope the fuck out, with my cousins right behind. I get inside, and go straight to bed, pretty much freaking out. Flash forward to next morning, all three of us go back to the same spot and then proceeded to go to where we thought the light would have been, and there was nothing there. No boot marks, no light, no nothing. To this day still have no idea. We were on a road trip from BC to San Diego, and we came upon a campsite just outside of Crescent City, California. We drove through. One side of the campground was relatively empty. I noticed a few scattered tents but nobody close to the location we ended up picking. We had tons of space. We wanted an early night, so I started a fire while my girlfriend started cooking. We ate, had a few beers, and climbed up to our rooftop tent, Tepui, with our dog by 9 p.m. or so. I had a rough time sleeping and woke up a few times but finally fell into a decent sleep. In the pitch dark with all of our tent windows and canvases closed, I was awoken at 1 a.m. by someone whistling outside of our tent the tune of When the Saints Come Marching In. After a few minutes of this repetitive whistling, I nudged my girlfriend, who awoke and was obviously freaked out as well. The whistling then turned to chanting things like, "When you sleep here you disrespect me, and when you disrespect me you disrespect the U.S. Marines." The person would then start spelling out words like FLEE. The verbiage and tone kept getting more aggressive, so we decided we had to make a move. I slowly unzipped the tent while our guard dog was snoring and got my head out of the tent. I took a few seconds to let my eyes adjust and figure out where the person was. I felt more confident once I could somewhat see and hear, so I climbed down and the girlfriend passed me the dog and she climbed down too. We flipped the tent up without securing it and we jumped into a truck, while the person was still whistling, to a motel in Crescent City. The next morning we drove back to get the few belongings that weren't in the truck, and a family who had been camping a few sites over said it went on for another 2 to 3 hours, and it was the scariest thing their family had ever experienced. Camping for the first time at Caddo Lake in northeast Texas. We got there around noon to set up camp. It's beautiful, tall thick pines, cypress trees. Really nice. And quiet. And still. Too fucking quiet and still. So we make camp, my wife and I, and start our little walk around the park, just to scope it out. It is deathly quiet in this place. We went up a nature trail. It was odd because there were so many down trees in the path in various stages of being cleared. Which was cool and all, but for me, the walls started caving in. I started having a panic attack in the middle of the trail. So still there. So quiet. I was lucky my wife has her ways to calm me down. Lol. On the back to camp, we swing by some pond. I don't remember the name offhand, but I swear to Christ it's the same pond from IT when they see Georgie's dead father rise out of the muck. Makes cringe just thinking about it. We get back to camp. Make what fire we can from our wet ass wood. Eat and get ready to turn in. By now it's drizzling and getting cold. All of a sudden, all at once, the damn wildlife decides to show up. All of them all at once, and then the trees started falling. I shit you not, one after another. Seemed like every 40 minutes, we would hear a giant pine tree break and start falling until it hit the soggy ground. I never made it to sleep. Constantly in fear of being crushed by a 40-ton tree that hates us for no reason. Probably not the ghost story you wanted to hear, but between the very odd lack of movement in the daytime, and the utter outburst of impending danger at night. Caddo Lake is fucking creepy as hell to me, and it still is. Never again. That whole region of Texas is now known as the thickness to us. I went camping and I kept hearing this noise. It sounded almost like a cow, but it was very metallic. I could tell it was something living. It was halfway between an air horn and a moo. It was much creepier than I am making it sound, trust me. I knew it was coming deep from the throat of something alive. It would go off every 30 to 120 seconds. It came in bursts of 3 and 5s in a very rhythmic fashion, each sound lasting exactly a second. There were definitely multiple, as some were close by, maybe 150 meters, and others almost out of earshot. Sometimes multiple would go off at once. This happened all night. The only time they stopped is when I heard multiple sets of footsteps outside my tent, heavy and irregular, just shuffling by. It felt curious, as if the beings were investigating us. They moved away and the sounds resumed, but slightly faster and closer. What the fuck? I don't know what it was. I was told by someone that it was a type of bird, but these sounded like they were on the ground, and I've been trying to find a bird that sounds like this with no luck. It sounded too throaty to be a bird too. It could have been some sort of machine set out in the middle of nowhere, but I don't know what that would be. It could have been supernatural or just plain human. I don't camp often, and it's usually with large groups when I do. But on our way to Maine from Alabama, me and my girlfriend stopped at Hone Quarry Campground in the George Washington and Jefferson National Forest just outside of Harrisonburg, Virginia, where we met some really chill folks and played Pokemon Go. That town was awesome. Anyways, there was nothing too unusual until we got our camp set up and were ready for bed. For some reason, something felt off. She felt it too. I was tired from driving all day, but didn't feel like I could get to sleep because of the uneasy feeling. After laying awake for maybe half an hour, I realized what it was. It was dead silent, and had been the whole time. It was the beginning of summer, in the mountains, in Virginia. There was a stream nearby. There should have been a lot of noise from wildlife. Nocturnal mammals frolicking around, millions of bugs trying to get laid. Nothing. It might have been my paranoia, but that feeling of something watching you kicked in, and I spent the next several hours completely terrified. Neither of us had phone service or weapons, and we were the only ones at the campground all night. After a bit, I started hearing the sound of twigs snapping in the distance. Something big was moving around, slowly. Fortunately, it never got particularly close, not close enough to see in the moonlight at least. After it moved on, about 2 a.m. some birds moved into the area and started chirping, and I was able to fall asleep. We stopped there again on the way back to Alabama. Set up camp again, but this time there was a family nearby with an RV. We set up the camp, settled in, and fell asleep to frolicking mammals and bugs trying to get laid. Until sometime in the early AM, where I woke up sharply to dead silence and the same feeling of being watched, where I stayed until the sun rose and we packed and left. Next time we make the trip, we're staying in Shenandoah on the opposite side of the highway. GW&J is just creepy all around. Some of the other campsites have creepy stories online, and I expect there were plenty more if I had gotten to speak more with the locals. My troop was at summer camp about 3 years ago. My friend and I had recently turned 15 and were excited to have this time away from our parents. Now, I should preface this with some info on where we were. We were in the middle of a national forest at a Boy Scout camp. We didn't know it at the time, but the campsites were originally where slaves' quarters were during the Civil War. But we were sleeping in big canvas tents that had a wooden floor, think wooden pallet, with a twin-sized cot on each side of the tent. There is a 2-foot gap between the beds in the middle of the tent. So the third night, Austin, alias, couldn't sleep. So I went to bed while he played on his phone. I slept fine, woke up once when I got too hot in the sleeping bag, but it was a good night's rest. The next day, Austin asked why I stood up in the middle of the night. Obviously I didn't stand up, so I asked him what he was talking about. He told me he saw a shadow standing over my bed at about midnight. He called my name and I didn't answer. He said that he figured I was ignoring him, but when he shined his phone over to me, he only saw me sleeping. When he turned his phone off, he could see the shadow again. We learned the next day that our campsite was the place where some slaves were murdered and shit. So we slept with a flashlight the rest of the week. Used to be in scouts when I was younger. Being an idiot teen from a generally ghetto lower class area, naturally I started smoking at a young age. One night on a weekend camping trip, I was craving a cigarette in the middle of the night, so I grabbed my pack and silently slipped away down the trails towards the nearby creek. I knew the trails well enough where I could navigate them deaf, dumb and blind, but I still brought my flick blade and a flashlight because I'm not completely stupid. As I'm walking down this trail, I look up and was amazed by the amount of stars I could see out in the middle of nowhere. The woods was always a fascinating thing for me, and the sounds of the crickets were deafening, with periodic specks of yellow dotting my vision as if the lightning bugs were dancing along to the symphony of sounds of the crickets and rustling leaves. So I get to the creek and light up my smoke and just sat there and chilled under the moonlight. When you grew up poor in a very lower class area, moments like these were serene, relaxing, couldn't begin to describe it. I finished and field stripped my cigarette, take the cotton out, dispose of the paper, and debated on smoking another because I was really enjoying my little piece of heaven out there by the creek. Out of nowhere, and to this day I'll never know what made me do it, I stood up, whipped out my knife and turned around to face the woods. Nothing spooked me, didn't hear anything, or sense anything. It was like something in the back of my mind just screamed at me, stand up, get ready to kill, for no apparent reason. I just stood there, knife in hand, for what seemed like an eternity, watching and waiting, and didn't know why, but I was angry. If any of you have ever been in a street fight, that anger you feel, that anger that drives you to try to hurt the other person as much as possible, that is the best way to describe the anger I felt as I stood there. It was like I was locked in place, something boiling up inside of me telling me I need to get ready for I don't know what. The noise stopped. The deafening cacophony of crickets fell silent all at once. It's like every living thing in those woods just up and vanished. I swear I could hear my heartbeat, it was so silent. Next thing I know, the drive to hurt whatever I was waiting for disappeared and was replaced with what I still consider the most genuine terror I have ever experienced. Me and my friends have been shot at and chased before too, back home, mind you. I took off. I didn't know what was there or if anything was there at all, but I took the fuck off and ran like I have never run before. I didn't look back. I didn't want to look back. I just wanted to get away, and I didn't know why. I eventually made it back to our site and the sounds of crickets resumed, but I refused to sleep that night. It's been years, I still don't have a clue what was out there and what made me react the way I did. But yeah, freaked me out. Not super creepy, but here it goes. One time I went camping with my parents, brother, and almost the entire side of my mom's family, around 30 people, so we were a big group. This was somewhere in Merced, California, and we were there I think 4 days. My cousin was the one always booking the areas, so he booked this one because there was a small lake for the kids to swim in and it was a nice spot. We were right by the parking lot and there was a store and bathrooms nearby, so it was great. He failed to mention, however, we were in front of a cemetery. Everything was fine until the second night. It was getting dark and we were getting things ready to make a fire when my cousin's son, around 4, starts running off towards the parking lot. My dad sees him and sees no adult watching him, so he goes after him. My dad asks him why he's running away and he says he's trying to catch the ball. So my dad starts looking for a ball and finds nothing and keeps asking the kid to point out the ball because he can't see it. He then tells my dad the ball moved and he goes after it, and this is when my dad freaks out because this kid is clearly chasing an invisible ball. He was running towards the cemetery and my dad grabs the kid and takes him back but says nothing because he thinks it's probably the kid being a kid. The next night same thing, but this time towards the direction of the lake, and the same story. This time he says there's a boy who keeps kicking it that way. My dad tells my cousin and she asks him about it, but he suddenly refuses to talk and acts like nothing happened. They forget about it until the next day when as soon as it gets dark this kid starts screaming and hiding his face against his mom. She asks him what's wrong and he keeps pointing to something and screaming. He won't stop hiding and every time he looked up he kept screaming and crying. The kid was terrified for some reason and he did not get out of tent for the rest of the night. We had no idea what he saw, but other things happened to other members of the group and we decided to leave the next morning. What freaks me out the most isn't really animals but people. My mind always wanders to axe murders, stalking the woods, or Blair Witch Project stuff. I was camping out at a secluded campsite, end of Kalalau Trail in Kauai, Hawaii, that's known for having a lot of squatters and hippies that live there year-round. It was about 3 a.m. and I was cold and couldn't sleep, so I got up to start a fire. I'm bent over and hear some rustling behind me in the dark. I shine my headlamp and see just a black silhouette of a person with a large club-like object in their hand. I yelled, "Who the fuck's there?" And the person started stumbling closer into the beam of my light. I now can see it's some dirty white dude with a huge afro hair, with a large stick in his hand, and he's completely naked. He still hasn't said anything. "What do you want?" He whispers, "I'm so cold and I need some fire," and points his stick at the now smoldering campfire. Not sure what to say, but also trying to not piss him off, the naked man with a pseudo-weapon, I say, "Sure dude, come get some fire." He shuffles over, lights the tip of the stick on fire, which basically goes out right away, and then he holds out his hand and tells me I want to go back to my bed, but I can't because I'm blind. "Will you show me?" "How did you see my fire then?" "I heard the noise. I'd like to go back. It's not far, just right over there." He points off into the darkness from where he came. At this point I'm pretty sure he's on acid or something and screwing with me. I decided it's better to play along if he's high rather than telling him to fuck off and then worry about an angry naked hippie man stalking me in the woods all night. That said, there was no way I was going hold his hand, or get withing distance. "I'll show you back, you can listen to the sound of my clapping to lead the way." I proceeded to clap and kinda nervously whistle him through the woods back towards the way he pointed. The whole time he's following me, he does this imitation of being blind by waving his arms around with his eyes closed. After about 30 meters, we reach this open shelter with pots and pans hanging from it and with a bamboo mat underneath. As soon as this guy touches the shelter, he immediately goes to his mat and curls up, still butt naked, and goes to sleep. Yeah, I stayed up the rest of the night. In the morning on the way out, he was still curled up as when I left him. I went to a park in the woods with a friend of mine one night after work. We had been there before and had a good time just hanging out, but it was darker due to the solstice. I figured it wouldn't be that big of a deal, so I pulled in and parked in the back like I did before. Now, I've never been really superstitious before, but this and some stories my other friends have told me have made me decide there is some validity. We stepped out of my car and the first thing we saw was a black cat. Cool, I like cats, but then I noticed the atmosphere felt off. It was dark and the air felt a little heavy. With only a nagging feeling, we made our way over to the park. This is where things started to feel real weird. The lights started flickering and we heard some crackling in the grass and fallen leaves. My friend clutched my arm and said she didn't feel safe. Neither did I at this point, but I calmly started walking her back. I was getting this really ominous feeling, and that's when the lights started flickering even more and then turned off. In the distance we saw a shadowy figure moving around towards us. She was terrified and I was internally losing my shit. We continued walking back, but at a very brisk pace. I handed her my keys and placed my hand in my pocket, over my knife. The walking noises followed us and we were walking as fast as you could without it being considered a full-on sprint. As we got back to the parking area, the cat was on my car staring into my eyes. I was ready for anything at that point, but we got into my car, locked the doors and got the fuck out of there. Never went back there since. This is totally the most unnerving thing that has ever happened to me, and I really don't know a ton about cars, so hopefully this is just my imagination / lack of car knowledge, not an actual haunting. Bear with me if it sounds crazy. My good friends got married this summer and had a campout wedding. It was amazing. The wedding was beautiful, everyone was awesome, lots of alcohol, weed, beautiful weather, new friends, etc. The only thing that went wrong was my Reto 70s tent ended up flooding. I'm not super seasoned camper, so I figured, no biggie. I had a big SUV, so I could just put my sleeping bag in there and sleep comfortably with the seats down. This was the last night before we planned to leave, so it was fine. It was about midnight when everyone decided to head to bed. I settled into my car and tried to turn on my car to warm the car up for about 10 minutes before I went to sleep. Unfortunately, my car's battery had died. We had stored some food in there and I think someone might have accidentally left an overhead light on the previous night. For whatever reason, the car started freaking out, the lights flashing, and the locks started locking and unlocking super fast. I was both confused and freaked out and tried to open the door, but every time I did, the locking was happening so fast it wouldn't work. My car had literally locked me in. I finally pried the manual lock open, got out and slept in my friend's car with her. That night, I had the creepiest and most vivid dream of my life, that I was a Vietnam soldier fighting in the trenches and my friends were dying around me. I think I am done camping for a while. Maybe forever. This past summer my boyfriend and I went camping in Wayne National Forest, Ohio. We were out there for 3 nights, and everything went fine each night except for our second night there. Before I start, let me just say that we were the only ones in this pretty established campground, most likely because it was supposed to rain the whole time we were there, which it did. Anyways, we had settled down for the night and it was about 11:30. I was on the edge of sleep, about to completely drift off when my boyfriend rolls his body onto mine, speaks slowly into my ear and says don't move or make a sound, but I think there's something outside the tent. I am immediately alert and I can definitely hear something outside the tent. We were sleeping on a slightly raised square piece of land that had a wooden plank border and was filled with very small gravel, probably for drainage reasons, and I could hear stepping on the gravel, right next to our heads. My breath catches and I am frozen, and my boyfriend says I have a hatchet. I'm going to try to make some noise to scare it off. I can't even squeak out a word as he rolls off of me, grabs the hatchet and begins banging on the side of the tent and making hissing noises in an attempt to scare off the animal outside. After a few minutes of silence we check outside the tent and nothing is there, so we settle back down and fall asleep. It wasn't until the next day, as we were discussing the event, that we realized it may not have been an animal. As we both had recalled, there had been distinct stepping sounds. No shuffling, no dragging of a tail, no skittering, but stepping. And it was the stepping of something that was heavy enough to make sound on packed gravel. There also hadn't been any snuffling near the tent wall, nor any sniffing, and after my boyfriend had made noise we didn't hear anything going off into the foliage that surrounded our campsite. No flapping either, so it wasn't something that could have flown off. As we talked about it, we began to realize that it may have been something bigger than what we had originally thought was a raccoon. Something possibly human. In our empty campground area. The only person we had seen at the campground was the ranger, and that had been during the day, and he had come in a vehicle. It was not the ranger this time, at midnight, at our rainy campground. We still talk about it, trying to decide if we've forgotten any details or are misremembering something. Reddit, if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them. Not sure whether this counts, but we, me and parents, I was about 16 at the time, were camping on this relatively rugged camping site, right inside the highest, oldest, and probably densest forest in the Netherlands. Now, about this forest itself. This forest is quite peculiar, and not just for its age. First off, due to centuries, perhaps even millennia, of extensive logging, which favors straight trees, almost every tree there is bent, or warped in some weird way. Secondly, that forest has an unusual amount of legends and tales in it, suggesting that it was a holy city before the christening. Though I don't believe in paranormality of any sort, this forest does have an unusually magic feel about it. Now, to what actually happened. So we were camped there, it was just after dark, and I decided to, just like my parents had been doing for the past few days, go take a hike into the forest, and see whether I could spot any wild pigs. I decided to just go left, right for a nice rectangular walk. The first stretch was relatively uneventful, the camping site was well within view, though in the darkness started to make things uncomfortable. As I approached the first intersection, I saw a black dot on the extension of the path. I didn't think much of it at first, but then the dot started moving, and as it was about to disappear into the foliage, a conga line of smaller dots came out of the other side, following the big one off the path. Shortly after making the turn, I started to get strange sensation, as if I was being watched. After frantically looking around for a few seconds, I decided it was just me and approached the next intersection. After making the next turn, the sensation got much stronger. Feeling as though whatever was watching me was a few feet behind, or to the side of me, instead of behind one of the trees along the path. When I saw the next, and last corner coming up, was about the point that a small niggling thought cropped up, a thought that took me a few months to work out, the thought that I might be going mad. As I turned the last corner, the pattern held on, it was now a few inches from the back of my head. If it existed, I would have felt it breathing down my neck, and the fact that I didn't only made it worse. In the end, I was sprinting towards the camping ground. Frantically, over my wheezing breath, humming to myself whatever tune was in my head at the time, just to keep the thought of going mad away. As I crashed through the camping ground gate, it stopped. I walked over to the tent, pulled up a chair, and contemplated what just happened. My buddy owns a lake property adjacent to some double railroad tracks and a spur coming off the tracks heading to an abandoned grain elevator nearby. He put our camping cabin on top of a hill next to both the operational double tracks and the abandoned railroad spur. Well, one night we are sitting at the part of the lake closest to the spur before it crosses a nearby highway. We heard gravel crunching and turned around to see a bunch of men holding flashlights. Okay, no big deal, must be the railroad tearing up the spur. We head back to the cabin right when a tank train is pulling to a stop at a signal right next to the cabin. My buddy talks to the crew and they say there was no one from the railroad working on the spur. Okay, maybe the local rednecks need some creosote to burn. Whatever. Well, once midnight rolled around, my buddy goes and looks at one of the trail cams facing the spur. As he gets there, he gets the SIM card and looks down the spur, only to see a tall silhouette with bright red glowing eyes walking slowly towards him. He noped the hell out of there. Told us to pack up and get to the driveway quick. We get in our cars and speed away. We meet up at a gas station about 5 miles away. We look at the trail cam footage and there were a ton of those red-eye silhouettes. We go back to our cabin to retrieve everything in there, and a ton of those red-eye creatures were everywhere, and they just disappeared into midair. We walk into a destroyed cabin to find a note written in what I hope is red ink saying, "We are always watching." My buddy sold the property to the railroad and workers have been reporting creepy sightings ever since. I was around 10, camping at Hilton Head. I'm a pretty curious and adventurous lad, so the first thing I do is sprint into the woods. Mainly to get away from leveling the camper. I'm in the woods having the time of my life and getting lost. Pretty soon, really lost. This doesn't really bother me, but I take note of it as I peep going in random directions. Pretty soon I see a drop off. Like, a very large drop. I take steps forward, feeling a smile involuntarily spread over my face. As I hear the leaves crunching under my feet, I see it. Its beauty, the solidarity it holds, projecting itself in the otherwise empty foreground of the cliff's forward empty space. A large, thick vine hanging from the canopy. It's thicker than my arm. About the size of my leg, really. I can't see the top. Instantly I lean over as far as I can, barely grab it, my knees flat on the ground and the full of my torso fully extended over the drop-off. I pull it back and swing. Swing over the drop-off and further still, the incredible length of this vine lurching me farther and farther into the drop. However, it became apparent, due to the great mass of the vine, and the little mass of my small prepubescent body, that I had not nearly enough momentum to get me back over the ledge. I had absolutely no idea what to do once the vine completely halted. So there I am, hanging over absolutely certain death, arms and legs wrapped around my only source of life. I screamed and cried for my dad. Then my mom, hoping somehow she could hear me better. No one came. I had no idea what to do. So I climbed. Shimmied my way up this fucking vine. With no inflation of truth do I say I climbed for 10 minutes. I couldn't see the bottom of the vine anymore, but now I could see the top. Once I get closer and closer to the canopy, the vine gives. I shut my eyes and cling on, holding my breath and tensing every muscle in my body. I feel the vine slowing. It successfully dropped me to a distance where I could jump to the bottom, so I did. After I did that I realized I shit myself with fear. Literally suit myself. So I pulled off my boxers, turned them inside out and wiped my eyes, then threw them into the woods. It was fine. Had on basketball shorts, super comfy. Felt good. Anyways, it's dark now, and I'm trying to find my way back. Blowing on this little whistle thing with a compass and flashlight on it that rings out this loud pitch to anyone nearby. Really scared, but still, not actually scared I wouldn't be able to find my way home. That's always stuck with me and I don't know why, just that feeling of, yep, I'm lost. And not actually being scared. Eventually I feel this tickle on my leg, so I swatted it. I feel another one and way too many for it just to be a tickle. So I turn the flashlight off and look at my legs. Baby fucking spiders crawling up my legs. Up my legs. I took off my shirt and swatted them off. Now I was scared. I saw tens of spiders' webs on the ground, apparently nests. Sprinting and swatting my legs with my shirt, I somehow sprint into civilization. Had no idea where the fuck I was, knocked on someone's home at what was now 9 and call my dad and he picks me up. Told him everything, but to this day my mother thinks I just got lost. Me and a few friends went camping in the North Georgia woods. We went off trail about a mile and set up camp next to a small creek. The site was great and we were all catching up on each other's lives, first semester of college, first time being together again. Around 11 at night we are all together under my tarp just talking, all of a sudden we hear a woman scream about 150 yards away. We go dead silent and the lights go off. I'm scanning the darkness looking for any sign of light at all. There is no way someone wandered out to our position without light. We sat in silence for an hour waiting to see if lights came on. Finally we decide the best action would be to bug out. Grab our bags, leave everything else and just go. My buddy's dorm was only about 30 minutes away, so we were in good shape, but the situation shook us. I'm a camp counselor and I've spent a lot of time in the woods. I've come face to face with bears, wolves, and cougars, and I've never been as unsettled as I was then. I've never been scared in the woods, just unsettled. We think what we heard was a fox. After we got some food and a bit of rest, we researched different calls and found a fox call that sounded very similar to what we heard, but you never know. We went back in the morning and got our stuff. I went camping once in my mid-20s with my now ex and about 5 of our good friends. We went to the other side of the lake from where we normally went camping one time, and shortly before sunset a guy around our age popped out of the woods and asked if he could join us. He had his own booze, so we figured why not? At first everything was fine. He seemed a bit off, but nothing we were concerned about initially. He said he had been long-term camping out that way and intended to stay out there as long as he could. To most people this would have been a red flag, but we had some hippie sensibilities and didn't think much of it. As the night wore on, though, he started to change. He pulled out a knife at one point in the evening and got belligerent a couple of times. He began claiming to have been living in the woods because he was hiding from the law. He started taking things we said the worst way possible. I don't remember how we encouraged him to leave peacefully, but he did go away. For the rest of the night, we speculated if he was actually dangerous or just weird. A week or so later, my ex told the story to a coworker of his, who described the guy back to my ex and then told him that someone he knew disappeared under mysterious circumstances with this guy. Whether there was any truth to it remains to be seen, but we never camped on that side of the lake again. I went backpacking for 3 days with 2 friends when I was 17. I'll call these friends Doug and Andre for the sake of the story. Doug was a couple of years younger than me and a freshman on the football team. eager kid, and excited to get going on the hike. Andre was 22, engaged, and at 6 feet 8 inches tall, he was more than capable of protecting us from any crazy beasts we might encounter on our trip. We decided to camp, probably illegally, on top of a rocky overlook about 3.5 miles up the trail. We decided we'd set up our base camp there, and hike some of the loop trails nearby in the coming days. As any good backpacker knows, a good water source is vital. Unfortunately for us, the closest source to our site ended up being about a 15-minute walk back down the rocky path we had hiked up to the site. More unfortunate than that, however, was the fact that this source was little more than a drip in the middle of the summer, and this meant that to fill our bottles you'd have to wait quite a while for them to fill up. Not the worst thing in the world, but it did make water collection time-consuming and tedious. After the sunset, it came time for one of us to go and check on the water source. Andre courageously volunteered to go down to the source and fill our water bottles. Doug and I continued to go about setting up our campsite and cleaning up our dinner. Not 5 minutes later, Andre comes running full speed back to camp. He's panting, out of breath, and scared stiff. Fearing the worst, what else would scare a half-giant like Andre? I asked him what scared him so badly. In a nervous tone, he said, "I saw a snake." "A snake? You're afraid of a snake?" I laughed at the thought of such a big guy being afraid of something so tiny, and, most likely, harmless. He said he refused to go back to the water source alone and demanded that Doug and I return with him. Of course, we complied, and we took the short hike down the mountain to the source to fill up our bottles. On our way back, I was still amused by his childish fear of snakes, and I started to tease him about being so afraid of snakes. As we were getting close to the campsite, I started to say, "There's absolutely no reason to be afraid of." And right as I was going to say, "snakes," my foot almost landed on a coiled up copperhead, causing me to jump out of my skin and instead scream, "Snakes!" like a little girl. I suddenly got why Andre was so afraid of snakes in the dark and was now the center of humiliation for the rest of the evening. Now, here's where it gets strange, and this is what I still can't figure out to this day. That night, after all the craziness of the snakes and the water source, we settled down to sleep on the overlook. No tent, just sleeping bags and mats on a rock with about a 200-foot drop. About 20 feet from where we were camping is where the forest began, and from our vantage point, it was very dark in there. The overlook was bathed in moonlight, and we had no trouble seeing what was around us, though. That said, a little after midnight, as we're drifting off to sleep, I hear a loud yelling sound coming from the woods. There was no echo, but there was a very quick reply in the valley below. Whatever it was, there were two of them, and we were pinned on this rock. As you can imagine, this noise startled me, Doug, and Andre. I quietly whispered to the guys, "What was that?" To get a very quick, scared response from Andre saying, "It's nothing, probably a coyote." I wasn't so sure, but I definitely didn't want to be the one to find out. The rest of the night was uncomfortable, and I finally got a little sleep. In the morning there was no evidence of what it could have been, and there were no other campers nearby. To this day, I can't figure it out. I know there are tons of weird noises that animals make in the night, but that one in particular has stuck with me for a long time as one of the strangest noises I've heard in the woods. I don't know if I camp enough to answer this, or if it's the strange that you're looking for, but one year my friend invited me to stay up in the woods at this old campsite he went to every year with his family. It was fun, we fished and went swimming and everything, and one night we had this little bonfire and made s'mores. Camping stuff. But then, at 2 a.m, someone whistled the Hunger Games call. Me, being an avid whistler, one of my few skills, whistled a return call. They did it again. I did it again. The campsite had maybe 40 people in it and everyone was intense except me and my friend, and the whistler. So this went on for about 5 minutes and the whistles devolved into random notes and counter melodies until I got fed up and decided to find them, so I stood up and walked into the forest. Barefoot. No flashlight. A total fool. Now, I didn't want to call out to them, because that would be too easy, so instead I slunk through the forest quietly, trying to hone in on their whistle. It took about 20 minutes before my friend realized we were going too far away from camp and should head back, but I had to freaking find them. A couple of minutes later we reached a little clearing. There was a cliff that ran down into the lake and a couple of trees that had fallen over, and there were 3 kids just sitting out looking to the lake. I called to them, saying that I'd been looking for them and how fun the whistling was, and who they were, but they didn't respond. They just sat there and looked at the lake. It was positively eerie, and they didn't even seem to hear me. I didn't get any closer to them than a couple of feet. I didn't want to spook them and have them demon throw me over the cliff or something. As soon as we got back to our campsite, there was no more whistling. Very creepy. In the morning, I asked people if they had heard us and they said no, so I guess everyone is just a super heavy sleeper or something. Probably going back though.